The NBA's greatest nightmare is here, and it could change everything in a very competitive Western Conference, and that nightmare is a healthy Kawhi Leonard. Game 2 was another classic between the Clippers and Nuggets that came down to the wire, and this all-time game was spearheaded by an all-time performance from Kawhi Leonard. 39 points, 5 assists, 3 rebounds, 2 steals, and a block, but shooting splits that are even more impressive. 15 and 19 from the field, 4 or 7 from behind the arc, and a perfect 5 from 5 from the charity stripe. What makes it even more impressive is that we were 3 quarters into this game and Kawhi was 11 of 12 from the field, only missing 1 shot. And no, these are not looks that were all at the basket or threes that someone else was generating for him and he was just catching and shooting wide open looks. No. These were self-created, deep in his bag, majority of mid-range shots that were heavily contested, and he was still knocking them down as if he had an aimbot on, which was all not only very impressive from an individual standpoint, but also from a team perspective as well. Because when Kawhi is performing at these heights, it turns a already really good Clippers unit into a true title contender. And this is the part of the video that I must apologize for. I should have done my due diligence talking about the Clippers towards the second half of the regular season, because they have easily been one of the more impressive teams in the league. And quite frankly, it's one of the reasons why the Western Conference playoffs is so intriguing. The records of many of these teams are not accurate representations of who they actually are. Various variables will change people's perspectives on the teams in the Western Conference. Reeves emerging as a quality third option with the Lakers, as well as a Luka trade. Jimmy Butler being added to the Golden State Warriors. OKC never really having a large sample size of their double big lineups. But in my opinion, the most interesting and ceiling raising variable that many people have not yet to really contextualize is a healthy Kawhi Leonard. And I think part of the reason for this is because a lot of the noise that surrounds Kawhi, especially when it comes to mainstream media, in particular Stephen A. Smith, who try to disregard who Kawhi Leonard is as a player, as well as, let's just face it, many people being upset and disappointed that every single time we go into the postseason that Kawhi unfortunately is not healthy. However, as many of us are aware, the storyline, or at least one of the pieces to the puzzle for the Clippers, is the idea of sitting him out for the first half of the season and effectively load managing him to the point where he would be prepared for where we are today. And it certainly has worked out. Again, towards the last 2 months of the regular season, the Clippers were one of the better teams in the NBA when adding Kawhi to their lineups. They had a record of 22-10 in the last 32 games, effectively from February 6th to the end of the regular season, with an offensive rating of 119 and a defensive rating of 111, giving them the 4th best net rating in the NBA with 8.2. Also, to be a bit more detailed, even certain lineups that the Clippers ran were some of the best in the NBA. Actually, to be more specific, a lineup of Chris Dunn, Zubac, James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, and Norman Powell gave us the 2nd best net rating in the NBA between February 6th to the end of the regular season, an offensive rating of 121.7, defensive rating of 105.2, and a net rating of 16.5, which is 2nd best in the NBA in that time frame, only to the Los Angeles Lakers. And even looking at all of those numbers, it doesn't really do it any true justice to who Kawhi really was throughout that stretch, because he didn't play all 32 games. Of the 25 games that Kawhi was active, the Clippers had a record of 20-5. When he was on the floor, they had an offensive rating of 120, a defensive rating of 109, and a net rating of 11.1. And just in case you're wondering, because I'm pretty sure everybody wants to know, what exactly was Kawhi averaging during the stretch? Well, in his 25-game sample size, he was averaging 24 points, 6 to 7 rebounds, 3.5 assists, nearly 2 steals, with shooting splits of 51, 43.5, and 83% from the free throw line. Very, very, very impressive. When we shrink it a little bit further to the last 15 games heading into the playoffs, Kawhi was averaging 26.5 points, 7 rebounds, 3.5 assists, 2 steals, and shooting splits of 55, 49, and 85. So yes, Kawhi was hyper efficient, moving fluently, while still being a force on the defensive side of the floor. A very impressive sample size of games heading into the postseason. And I can't even sit here and say that these games were not anything of importance, because because they actually were. The Clippers were fighting for seeding because they didn't want to find themselves towards the tail end of the playoffs, heading into the play-ins and potentially matching up with the Oklahoma City Thunder in the first round. They actually fought for the right to play the Denver Nuggets in round one, and they've been able to really capitalize off of this ability to match up with the Nuggets team that is slightly spiraling right before our eyes. And so far in this matchup, I do believe what people are starting to quickly remember about Kawhi, because yes, I think a lot of people may have forgotten who Kawhi Leonard is as a player when he's healthy, and that is one of which that is top 5 in the NBA. I do believe that 5th spot has been, fulfilled by a couple of names that I don't believe are justified and warranted, in large part due to injuries and unavailability from certain players, in particular Kawhi. But when he is playing at this level, he is unequivocally in that top 5 conversation, separating himself from the rest of the pack, and plays just as well as anybody else. I quite frankly believe that he is better than Jason Tatum. He is better than Joel Embiid, obviously because Embiid isn't playing, but also he is straddling the line of being in conversations with even Shea and Luka at times, especially when Shea isn't knocking down his shots and Luka doesn't have the ability to go downhill. That's how impactful of a player we're starting to see here. But again, shouldn't be much of a surprise, bro. Kawhi has been this good in the postseason for a very long time. And again, I understand the hesitations. I get why many people didn't want to give the credit where credit was due to his inability to just be available for postseason play. But this is around the time when we would normally get the update that Kawhi would not be available for games 3 or 4 or for the rest of the postseason run, but haven't heard it yet. And quite frankly, he's looked just as good as he has ever looked at any point in his career so far. And I also believe that many people were hesitant and skeptical of the practice of being this extreme with the load management with Kawhi in the early stages of the season, not only because it was still unclear and not definitive of what was happening with Kawhi and his knees and everything else, but also because of how much of a failure we saw going on out in Philly with Joel Embiid and Paul George, and then the debacle that was going on in New Orleans with Zion. And so I think a lot of people were like, hey man, this isn't going to work at all. Like, not even a little bit. You add on top of the fact that you're in a very competitive Western Conference where seeding matters a lot. And this is the part of the video where I have to give credit, and I mean a lot of credit, to not just Ty Lue, but James Harden. Too many people throughout the year were just looking at Harden's shooting splits and just sitting here saying he wasn't playing great basketball, but that was far from the truth. If you've ever sat down and actually watched the Clippers pre-Kawhi emerging back into top 5 status, you will clearly see that James Harden was completely, and I do mean completely, carrying that offense, and I believe not only making everyone around him better, but in particular making Zubac into a borderline all-NBA caliber player, especially offensively, because offensively, I don't think I've ever seen this form of Zoo play this well, and a lot of that has to do with the reps and practice that we see from the two-man game between Zoo and Harden all season long. But it just wasn't Zoo who was benefiting off of Harden's passing and playmaking ability. It was everyone. And I think too many people got caught up in the shooting splits instead of just watching the impact that was Harden. And shout out to Ty Lue as well. I think he's gotten the most out of all of the supporting cast members. Shout out to the front office also. I think a lot of people gave them a lot of flack for moving on Paul George without giving him the contract that he was seeking for. Of course, fast forward now, when hindsight is always 2020, they certainly made the right decision to move on from him. But in the moment, it wasn't that clear, especially when some of the, the replacements probably weren't going to live up to par. But I think that Harden, that coaching staff out there led by Ty Lue, Big Zoo, Norman Powell, and everybody else on the roster, they don't get enough credit for weathering the storm by effectively missing their 2 best players in last year's regular season. Both of them were not available for the first half of the season, one of which playing for the Sixers, the other which wasn't available, and everybody else had to pick up the slack, which has effectively positioned them where they are right now, where they get to match up against a Nuggets team that, again, doesn't seem like their self. Now, this does not mean that the series is over. Certainly, it's far from it. But this version of Kawhi performing at the way in which he does is very impressive. Kawhi was actually so impressive in that game too that it forced Denver to shift, I believe, a bit too much at times, but do a lot of shifting even on mid-range jumpers. That's how impressive he was. This is a Nuggets team that tends to concede on mid-range shots to not allow better looks from around the floor, but yet Kawhi was so amazing that they were shifting. You had both Jokic and Jamal Murray putting themselves out of position. Pay Peyton Watson trying his hardest, throwing Aaron Gordon at him as well, and Kawhi quite literally could not miss for 3 quarters. Very impressive stuff. And so if this is the version that we see of Kawhi moving forward, as well as a James Harden that I think is a bit underrated at this stage of his career, the things in which he's been able to do, manage his offense. And I would go as far as to say in game 1, I actually think Harden was better offensively than Kawhi. I do fear not only for the Nuggets, but for the rest of the NBA. I do believe, however, there is a saving grace in all of this, is that in the second round, they have to match up against the Oklahoma City Thunder, who certainly feel as if like they are positioned to knock out everybody in the Western Conference so far, matching up with the Memphis Grizzlies. But of course, in the second round, it's not going to be that easy. There's going to be a player in Kawhi Leonard that they may not have ever seen so far in their young playoff careers. So that is also going to be a very interesting series. But again, don't want to knock out Jokic and the Denver Nuggets just yet. But I do believe having this version of Kawhi changes everything. And I do mean everything. But it shouldn't be that much of a surprise. Kawhi is one of the greatest playoff performers we've ever seen. He has a track record to prove it, and he is also someone that now we can see when he is healthy and available, and they now have a potential proven method to get him to the postseason in said fashion, then we're talking about a top 5 player on a very well-constructed roster, great coaching staff, and now in the postseason going toe-to-toe with someone that many people consider to be the best player in the NBA, in Nikola Jokic. And I would certainly argue that the impact gap between Kawhi and Jokic so far in this series isn't that significant at all. It's going to be very interesting to see how this series continues to unfold, but I must admit I am very happy and pleased to see Kawhi Leonard fully healthy and available, because it does change everything. And I do mean everything for the Western Conference playoffs. It puts the Denver Nuggets in a very peculiar situation, because without them actually knowing it, even though they are the 5th seed, there's a possibility that the Nuggets are actually matching up with the second best team in the Western Conference, and a team that is much closer to competing with OKC than many people originally thought before the playoffs even began. So I must admit, I have to apologize, chat. I was wrong. I should have not fumbled the opportunity to convey to you all how great this Clippers team really is. Because this Clippers team is really, really great. Zubac is not only amazing on the offensive side of the floor with the 2-man game with him and Harden, but defensively, he is also really impressive, to the point where I would dare argue he should be a fringe all-defensive team selection. But if not that, he certainly is a fringe all-NBA selection. And actually, I had him on my all-NBA team. Furthermore, the improvement of Norman Powell this season, taking upon himself an extra offensive scoring load, again, kind of replacing what they've been missing from Paul George early on this season from last year. And James Harden has really been very impressive. Please do not allow the shooting splits to get you all confused. And when you add on top of all of that a top 5 player, I do believe things will get very interesting. And someone who makes his mid-range jump shots to this degree, so much that they're damn near doubling on middies, yeah, the Clippers are going to be a very, very, very difficult out, even for the Oklahoma City Thunder. But with that being said, we're going to keep an eye on all of this. I just wanted to give you a brief update of what's going on, not only in that series, but overall why the Clippers should be viewed as the second best team in the NBA. And after they knock out the Nuggets, because I do have them winning this series, it's going to be very interesting to see what this Clippers team looks like against the Oklahoma City Thunder with this version of Kawhi. So yeah, with that being said, I thank you all very much so. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.